Hello and welcome to Topic 1, Lecture 1 for this week. And in this lecture, we're going to be defining the formal criminal justice system. So for this week, you'll be listening to two lectures. The first lecture that you're listening to now, you'll be learning about the steps in the formal criminal justice system, okay? So we're going to define what the criminal justice system is, and then we're going to look at the steps that are associated with the process of the criminal justice system. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to be learning about the so-called informal criminal justice system. As you're going to learn, you're going to learn all the steps for the criminal justice system today, but as you know from reading in your chapter, and as you'll learn as we move on to the next lecture, that very few offenders go through all of the steps of the criminal justice system. That there is basically many start at the top of the system, but by the time you get to the last step in the process, very few of those offenders are left. And so in the next lecture, you're going to learn about this thing called the criminal justice funnel and the factors that cause that funneling or that winnowing effect. So let's get started taking a look at the formal criminal justice system. So what is the criminal justice system? Well, when we're referring to the criminal justice system, we're sort of referring to two elements. One is the stages that an offender passes through. And so once an individual has some contact with the criminal justice system, there's a certain process that takes place, sort of almost like an assembly line of steps that the offender passes through. Arrest, charging, trial, conviction, etc. All of these are stages within the criminal justice system, and we're going to be learning about those in today's lecture. Another thing that the criminal justice system refers to are the governmental agencies that are charged with enforcing the law at each of these criminal justice stages. And so, today and throughout the course of the semester, you're going to be learning about these agencies. And so law enforcement or police is an agency that is, obviously, as the name sort of suggested, charged with enforcing state and federal law, depending on what type of law enforcement agency it is. Of the Office of the Prosecutor, again, a state agency, and the prosecutor is a lawyer who works for the state, and the prosecutor is responsible for determining whether or not this person who's arrested is charged with the crime, and then moves forward from that point on, basically representing the state in all matters that might follow that charging decision. The court system, where trials take place, but as we're going to learn, many cases never go to trial. And so there are a lot of other activities, pretrial activities, that take place in the court system. And then finally, if a person is convicted or pleads guilty to a particular charge, then there will be a correction that will follow. And that can range from anywhere to home confinement, probation, all the way to be convicted with a sentence of the death penalty. And so the stages and the agencies are what make up the criminal justice system. Now, when we talk about the formal criminal justice process, we're basically talking about the process that takes an offender through a series of decision points, okay? And that's what we're going to be learning about in this lecture. And so the idea is that at each of these stages within the criminal justice process, there are certain steps that the offender goes through, and that key decisions are made at each of those steps. It's oftentimes referred to as the criminal justice assembly line. So, think about if you've ever worked or somebody who's worked in a manufacturing plant, right? An assembly line is, like a car manufacturing assembly line. You start with, one thing, and some workers add something to it, and then they add more things at the next step, more things, until you have a completed car at the end of the assembly line, okay? So a lot of times people think about the formal criminal justice process as this assembly line that all these steps that offenders pass through, where distinct key decisions are made at each point. But as I mentioned earlier in the lecture, very few people are processed through all of those steps. And that's what's known as the criminal justice funnel. And we'll be learning about what the criminal justice funnel is in more detail in the next lecture. There are reasons that we're also going to be learning about in the next lecture for why so few offenders pass through all of those points in the process, stages in the process. And so in the next lecture, as we learn about what causes that criminal justice funnel, we're going to be learning about this thing called the courtroom work group and the criminal justice wedding cake, okay? But before we look at the funneling of the criminal justice system and the causes for that funneling, it's important that we learn about the specific steps within that so-called criminal justice assembly line. And so we're going to spend the rest of the lecture taking a look at that, and let's get started. Okay, so to help us sort of bring the formal criminal justice process to life, I'm going to be using the HBO show The Night Of as an example to help bring it up to life. We're not able to watch the show because this is an online class. I encourage you to watch it if you have HBO, but I will try to bring it to life for you as much as possible. The Night Of is about the night of a murder, okay? And the murder involves this young lady who's sitting here on the left-hand side of the screen, and her name is Andrea Cornish. And the criminally accused is Nazir Khan, sitting next to her, played by Riz Ahmed, who you might be familiar with from the movie Sound of Metal that came out this summer. Nazir Khan is an interesting person. He is American-born, Pakistani-American. He lives in a really sheltered environment with his family in Queens, but he's really eager to stop living this sheltered life. So one evening he gets invited to a party in Manhattan. He borrows his dad's cab. His dad's a cab driver, and he drives in the city to go to this party that he got invited to in Manhattan. He can't find the party. He gets totally lost. He's not familiar with Manhattan. And because he's in a cab, a young lady gets into the back of his cab thinking that he's an on-duty cab driver. And that person is Andrea Cornish. They head back to her apartment, they do a bunch of drugs, and they drink a bunch of alcohol. They play this weird game where they put their hand on the table and they take a knife to sort of make sure it's that they don't go between the fingers kind of game. So they're engaging in some sort of reckless behavior. And Nazir Khan, he's not used to living that life. They go upstairs to her bedroom. They end up having sex. They pass out. Nazir Khan wakes up. He's getting ready to say goodbye. He's putting his clothes on. He turns on the lights, and Andrea Cornish is covered in blood, having been stabbed multiple times. Nazir Khan freaks out. He leaves the apartment. He realizes that he left his keys in the apartment. He's got to break back in to get the keys. And then when he gets in there, he gets the keys, and he's looking around the apartment. And he's thinking, oh my God, this looks like a crime scene. So he starts taking the drugs, the knife, etc., with him as he leaves to make it seem like this isn't a crime scene, at least not one that he's been involved in, because his fingerprints would have been involved on some of the items. He gets pulled over by the cops in his cab. He's ultimately arrested, and the show is really about what happens to this individual who claims that he didn't commit this murder, and the way that the criminal justice system responds to it. It's a great show if you get a chance to watch it. And so let's get started by using that show to bring to life some of the steps within these stages of the criminal justice process. Okay, so here are the 4 stages in the criminal justice process. And I want you to encourage you to take notes while you're listening to these stages, because as you're going to see at the end, there's an extra credit opportunity to take a quiz in order to get points if you are able to put the steps in the criminal justice process in the right order. So we're going to be taking a look at stage 1, which is police procedures, stage 2, which is the prosecutorial stage, stage 3, which is the trial stage, and stage 4, which is the correctional stage. So let's go ahead and get started taking a look at those steps in those stages. All right, so stage 1, police procedures. Now, as your textbook points out, police are the gatekeepers of the formal criminal justice process. It's police who have first contact with a potential offender. And if you don't have contact with law enforcement in some way, that individual is never going to be brought into the criminal justice process. And we're going to learn in the next lecture that, there are many, many crimes committed in the United States. And we know that because of crime victimization surveys that you're going to learn about in chapter 2. And so we know that people have been victims of crimes, right? So we know that crimes are happening, but many individuals are never found or make contact with police. So they may have committed a crime, but they are never brought into the criminal justice system. And so really police are these gatekeepers, right? That without contact with law enforcement, then an offender, right, will never be brought into the criminal justice system. Also keep in mind that police use their professional judgment and discretion when doing their job, okay? We really do, and we'll be talking about this more when we get into our section on law enforcement. But police are out there either patrolling in cars or they're walking the beat. I live in River West. We have bicycle cops. We have cops that just walk on our streets, sort of trying to make their presence be known, so that they will come in contact with people. But a lot of times they use their discretion about whether or not they should investigate or arrest somebody, etc. So we want law enforcement to have as these gatekeepers. You want them to use their discretion and not be like formally bound that every time you make contact with an individual, you must bring them in for questioning, right? Because that would really overload and overburden our system, and it would actually be like sort of contrary to justice. So let's take a look at the steps that are in the stage of the police procedure. And there are 4 steps, and let me just go ahead and put each of these up here. So we'll talk about these separately. So step 1 in stage 1 is the initial contact. Step 2 is investigation. Step 3 is arrest. And step 4 is custody, okay? And let's talk about them first, and then we'll talk about how they play themselves out in the night of, because there we have Nazir Khan in the cab getting pulled over by the cops. And so initial contact is when cops make initial contact with an individual, and they begin asking themselves based on that initial contact whether or not they should take a next step to sort of investigate what's going on. Initial contact can take place in a lot of ways. In the case of Nazir Khan, the initial contact with law enforcement take place because he is driving down the streets of Manhattan about 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning, and he makes a turn. He makes a right-hand turn on a red light, and that's not allowed in New York. Maybe it's a left-hand turn. It's some sort of turn that's not allowed. And he gets pulled over by the cops. And that's basically the initial contact with Nazir Khan. They pull him over, the cops get out, and then they start thinking, okay, what's going on here, right? So that initial contact could be law enforcement pulling you over in a vehicle. Initial contact could just be cops seeing you on the street and asking you a couple of questions. Initial contact can come through somebody calling the cops and saying, hey, we're really hearing some activity outside of our house. It seems like somebody's in trouble. Can you come out and take a look at it? Initial contact. So, you'll be reading about in your chapter all the different ways in which cops make that initial contact. Now, just because cops make initial contact with somebody doesn't necessarily mean they're going to take any action. So, for example, if they had pulled over Nazir Khan and the cops' initial contact asked him a couple of questions, and he said, you know what, I'm working late, I'm a little tired out, and that's why I, made this wrong turn on this red light. Cops would do a little investigation, and they would say, look, this guy doesn't seem drunk. He's obviously, his badge matches his ID or whatever for, being in the cab. And they might say, go ahead on your merry way, right? Just say, there's no need for us to ask you more or do a further investigation. That wasn't the case with Nazir Khan. He was up all night drinking and doing drugs. And so when they pull him over and he unrolls his window, as the cop says, that like she's just getting drunk conversating with him, right? That he smells like a tequila company had, exploded, right? Because his eyes are red, he's glassy-eyed, he smells like alcohol. And so they begin to do an investigation. They have him get out of the car, they pat him down, etc. Okay? And so the investigation can take a few minutes, right? Cops pull over, see that you're drunk, then continue, ask you to walk the line, and that's an investigation. But investigations can be very long. Law enforcement might get a tip that some crime is taking place, and they may spend months investigating before they decide to issue an arrest warrant. Now, in the case of Nazir Khan, what happens is that while they are sort of investigating and thinking about arresting him and taking him into custody for drunk driving, they get a call on their phone in the car. And the phone call, or not a phone call, but they get a message on their the radio, and they basically say, you guys need to get over here. There's a potential homicide that's gone on. We've found broken in house with a dead body. And so they basically don't know what to do with Nazir Khan, and they just sort of put him in the backseat of the car. They don't arrest him. He's not technically in custody because they've got this bigger matter to deal with, okay? And in fact, they sort of say, maybe we should just cut him loose because we've got to go investigate this other thing, right? And so it could have very well be that he was cut loose. He wasn't. And so I won't go on to details with what happens ultimately in terms of the way he gets arrested and brought into custody. They actually find the bloody knife that's on him later on within this first episode. But if based on the investigation, there's probable cause that a crime has been committed, the law enforcement will arrest an individual, and that arrest has to be based on probable cause. We'll talk more about that as we move on. And then through the course of the semester. And then once the individual is arrested, they are taken into custody. And in other words, once you are taken into custody, okay, that you don't have the liberty to leave, right? You are in police custody, and they will do with you what they want within the legal limits of the law. So you'll be brought down to the police department. You could be fingerprinted, mugshot, searched, etc. Okay, your liberty is taken away. And so initial contact, investigation, arrest, and custody. And in the night of, once they're actually going to they bring him back to the police station, and they're actually like, let's let him go. He's not drunk anymore because he's been sitting here for so long. They do a final pat down, and in that final pat down before they release him, they find the bloody weapon. And at that point, they arrest him, and he actually tries to get away, and he can't because he's in custody at that point. Okay, the next stage is the prosecutorial stage, and deals with the prosecutor's office. Let's again put up all the steps that are associated with this stage. There are 5 steps: charging, preliminary hearing, grand jury, arraignment, bail detention, and plea bargaining. And then we'll talk about each of these individually. All right, now just because somebody is arrested and taken into custody by law enforcement does not mean that they're actually going to be charged with a crime. It's up to the prosecutor to determine whether or not an individual should be charged and what that individual should be charged with. One of the concerns that the prosecutor has is they have to ask themselves, if I'm going to charge this individual with a crime, and this individual pleads not guilty to the charge, it's very likely that this person could end up going to trial, and the prosecutor would have to demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that this individual is guilty. And so the prosecutor uses discretion, just like law enforcement uses discretion, to decide whether or not this person should be charged with a crime. They might say, you know what, based on the evidence, we don't feel like we have enough evidence to get a conviction if we go to trial. So they might decide not to charge that individual. They might look at the crime, and they might say to themselves that this is a relatively minor crime, and that there are other ways that this is so minor that we just don't feel like we want to charge this individual with the crime, because there's better things that we can, do with our time in the prosecutor's office. So they may decide not to charge. There might be political reasons to not charge somebody or to charge somebody, right? There might be political pressure to charge this individual a certain way. You're going to be reading about those in the textbook in this chapter, but we go into a lot more detail in that when we get to the chapter on courtroom personnel, one of which is the district attorney. So the first step in the prosecutorial stage is charging somebody with a crime. Now, once a prosecutor decides that they want to charge somebody with a crime, they say, you know what? There's enough evidence. We feel like we could get a conviction. That there's another step before moving forward in the process, and that step is basically a check on the power of the prosecutor. Okay, we live in a democracy, and in a democracy that we want there to be limits on governmental officials, and the prosecutor has a lot of power. When they charge somebody with a crime, it could end up in some sort of conviction and loss of liberty. And so we want to make sure that there's a check on the power of the prosecutor. And there's two ways of doing that, and that's step two. That once a prosecutor says they want to charge somebody, that desire to charge somebody can go to a preliminary hearing. We're going to be learning a lot more about this as we go through the semester. But a preliminary hearing is just where it takes place before a judge, and the defense attorney and the prosecutor are there. And the prosecutor says that I think there's probable cause to sustain this charge. And then the judge will make a determination about whether or not there is enough evidence to support the charge. A grand jury doesn't take place in front of a judge. A grand jury is an actual large jury. That's why it's called a grand jury. It's a jury of humans, of people, and the prosecutor presents their evidence to why this person should be charged, and then the grand jury will issue an indictment. Again, we'll learn more about that. But when thinking about the order of the steps, the prosecutor wants to charge, but the preliminary hearing or the grand jury just basically okays those charges. Okay, it's a check on the power of the prosecutor. Once an individual is charged and that charge has got the approval of a judge or a jury, then the individual is brought into court in this thing called an arraignment. Okay. So the next step is that the individual is brought into the arraignment and they are told what the charges are, because that's part of our due process in the United States. You can't be charged and not told what you're being charged with. So in the arraignment, you're told what the charges are. You enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. And then you are assigned counsel at that point if you don't have counsel. Okay. So the arraignment is where the person's brought in, the criminally accused, the one charged with the crime. They're told what they're being charged with. They enter a plea, and then they're assigned counsel. Also, what takes place in the arraignment, usually, it could take place at a separate time, but usually at the arraignment, is a determination of setting bail. Okay. And so that once you're charged with the crime, you're so-called bound over for trial. Okay. Because, unless you plead guilty, right, then, but you could still be detained because you're going to be, could pose a threat to society. But if you say not guilty, and most people do initially say not guilty, then they're bound over for trial. The court has to determine whether or not that person can wait for the next step in the process, sentencing in the case of a plea, a guilty plea, or preparing for trial if it's a not guilty plea. They have to make a determination about whether this person is going to come back for future court appearances, or whether or not this person poses a danger to society. And so they'll set a bail to make sure that they come back, or they might deny bail because this individual poses such a threat. And then if the person can't meet the bail, then they're going to be detained in the county jail. Okay. In the case of Nazir Khan, because it was such a horrific murder, and also because he had family in Pakistan, they denied him bail, and he had to stay in Rikers Island as he prepared for trial. A plea bargaining is that once a person enters a plea, oftentimes not guilty, but not always, that the prosecutor will begin a bargaining process with the defense attorney to determine whether or not that you might charge a prosecutor, and this is the case with Nazir Khan. The prosecutor, Helen Weiss, charged Nazir Khan with first-degree intentional homicide. She actually got a lot of pressure from her boss to reduce that to something lower, because since Nazir Khan was Pakistani American, there were attacks taking place in the city on Pakistani Americans. They were angry at them, sort of holdover anger from 9/11, even though Pakistanis didn't have anything to do with 9/11. but Arab Americans. And so she was encouraged to reduce the charge to second degree homicide, second degree murder. And then Nazir Khan gets a better attorney for a while than John Turturro, than John Stone, and that she says the only offer that they will accept is man one with a minimum of 20 years in prison. And actually, the district attorney accepts that plea in the plea of bargaining agreement. Okay, so check on the charge through the preliminary hearing or grand jury, arraignment, bail detention, plea bargaining. Okay, so let's take a look at stage 3, which is the trial stage. And here we see John Stone, Nazir Khan's attorney, who's basically defending him at trial. Let's take a look at the different steps within the trial stage. Trial 1, 2 is sentencing, and 3 is appeal. And we'll talk about these each individually, okay? Now, as I mentioned on the last slide, a lot of cases never go to trial, okay? People might plead not guilty, but then they would engage in a plea agreement with the prosecutor and then end up entering a plea of guilty, never basically waiving their right to a trial. In fact, 90% of cases, and we're going to be talking about this in the next lecture, 90% of cases do not end up going to trial. But some do. And even though only 10% end up going to trial, a trial is, still a major component of the criminal justice system. And so if a person does end up going to trial, that trial can be held either before a jury. You have a right to a jury trial, but you can waive that right, and your trial could be held just in front of a judge, and then the judge can make the determination about whether or not you are guilty or not guilty. And that basically is the outcome of a trial. That an individual after trial is either acquitted of the charges, that means that they're found not guilty, and at that point they step out of the criminal justice process, they're free to go. Or if they are found guilty, then they are subject to the next step, which is sentencing. Once an individual is found guilty, that there's usually a separate court process that takes place, which is the sentencing process. And that the prosecutor and the defense attorney will make a recommendation on what the sentence should be if the individual is found guilty. And then it's ultimately the judge that imposes that sentence. And that sentence can go from anywhere to, a probation, a sentence of probation, home confinement, some sort of fine that they have to pay. And as I mentioned earlier, it could be as severe as incarceration with no possibility of parole, or even the death penalty we still use in the United States. Okay. And then the third step within the trial stage, okay, even though it's not a part of the trial, it comes after the trial and after the sentencing. Okay. So, and that's the appeal step. So after an individual, if you have been acquitted, okay, the state can't appeal the acquittal. If you're found not guilty, the state can't say, wait a second, let's appeal this, okay? Because that's a violation of the Fifth Amendment's double jeopardy clause. We don't you can't be charged twice for the same crime. And so if you are charged and found not guilty, you can't say, wait a second, let's have a second chance at this. Like, let's appeal and then have a redo. They can't do that, okay? It also just would give way too much. If you allowed prosecutors to appeal, would give way too much power to the prosecutors, right? Only the criminally accused can appeal, okay? And everybody gets a right to one appeal at the state and federal level. And that basically it happens after you're convicted, and it's a process of looking at, hey, were your rights violated during trial? Did you have incompetent counsel? Was there jury bias? Was evidence admitted that shouldn't be admitted? Was there a lack of fairness? Okay. And that attorneys submit briefs to the judges, and the judges will rule on those briefs. We'll talk more about that as we go on. But that's the trial stage: trial, sentencing, and then the appeal is included in the trial stage as well. Okay, let's take a look at the last and final stage, which is the stage for correctional procedures. And there are 3 steps in this stage: correctional treatment, release, and post-release. So once you've been sentenced, okay, that there's the correctional departments of correction step in at that point. So if you've been sentenced to probation, then you are assigned a probation officer, which is a part of the Department of Corrections. There's certain requirements that you have to meet with your probation officer, and then if you fail to meet those requirements, then you have to serve your sentence. So usually you get a sentence of like 3 years, but that the correction is actually probation, and if you meet the terms of that probation, then you basically your sentence is deferred. You don't have to actually fulfill that sentence. And so probation is a part of that correctional treatment. Home confinement is a part of that correctional treatment. If you are actually incarcerated into some sort of secure confinement, I mean, obviously that's a form of correctional treatment. Okay, and so the first step in the correctional procedure is correctional treatment. The second step is that you're released after you've satisfied your sentence. And so once your sentence comes to an end, or once your probation, you've satisfied that, then you will be released. If you're on parole, that you may be released from secure confinement. However, you are basically still under some sort of correctional treatment, very similar to if you are on probation. And so you might be released and you have on parole, and you have to satisfy those conditions of parole. And if you don't, then you're going to be confined into a correctional institution. But once you satisfy your conditions of parole, you are released into the community. And a lot of times there might be after the release that there are some post-release sort of help that you might get, right? Not a part of your corrections, but a way of integrating back into society. That could be some sort of like assignment to a caseworker, or being in a group at a community a facility, or not a facility, but a community center that gives you the tools that you need to actually do well as you are re-released and you join the community again. So correctional treatment, release, post-release. And you might be asking, why do I have a picture there of the great actor Michael Kenneth Williams? Because, how does this, obviously he was in The Night Of. He played a person who was in secure confinement at Rikers Island. His name was Freddie Knight. As you know, he died over the weekend. He was found dead yesterday, and which it was a tragic loss. You might know him from playing Omar on The Wire. He's a great actor. But he plays a great role in this, because basically when Nasir Khan gets put into correctional treatment, into confinement, he aligns himself with a gang, and the protection that he gets is under the tutelage of Freddie Knight. And it's kind of a sad story because, Nasir Khan enters the correctional treatment, a very innocent person. And by the end, he comes out and he's basically looks like a seasoned criminal. Okay. And so it's a great sort of illustration of some of the real detrimental aspects of correctional treatment. Okay, so those are the formal steps in the criminal justice process. And as I mentioned, you get an extra credit opportunity, to test your knowledge of these steps, okay? And so as you'll see in the module, there's an extra credit criminal justice steps in the process quiz that you can take. And it's your opportunity to sort of test yourself on the steps that we talked about. It's a drag and drop quiz, and so you drag the different steps in the process into the correct stages, okay? You get 5 minutes to take it. You can unlimited attempts. Your other quizzes don't get unlimited attempts, but this one does, because take it as many times as you want until you get the steps in the right steps. Now you're testing yourself, so it's your honor system, but no notes, no textbook. Put it away and just see if you know the steps, and then learn what you don't know, and then come back to the quiz, take it again, so that you can actually learn it. Everybody who completes the quiz and putting the steps in the right order earns 5 extra credit points. But for the first 5 students that do it in the least amount of time correctly, they will win an additional 5 additional extra credit points. So for a total of 10, at least for 5 students, and 5 points for everybody. So it's a fun quiz. I hope you take it, and thanks for listening.